In August of 1908, a survey team entered a white salt basin on the edge of the western desert to complete what should have been a routine government mapping job. They carried measuring chains, a transit, field books, water barrels, and one large camera packed in a padded wooden case. They were expected back in 12 days. They returned after 26. When the team reached the rail station, the photographer would not let anyone touch his equipment. The youngest assistant had to be helped down from the wagon because he had stopped sleeping. And the chief draftsman, a man named Lionel Varet, kept one hand pressed over the inside pocket of his coat the entire journey home, as if he was guarding something flat and breakable. Within 3 weeks, the survey report was logged, stamped, and transferred to the district archive. Within 3 months, it was gone. No public copy was circulated, no corrected edition appeared, no final map was ever released to the newspapers that had already announced the expedition's completion. The official explanation was brief, almost lazy. The measurements were compromised by ground instability. The work had been invalidated. A replacement survey would be commissioned later. It never was. That alone would be enough to make the case strange. Governments lose papers all the time. Reports are delayed, field measurements get challenged. But this story does not begin with a missing file. It begins with a surviving note written in pencil on tracing paper, folded twice and hidden for nearly 50 years inside the false back of a survey chest. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matches Varet's field script. On it, beneath a rough contour sketch of the basin floor, are 9 words. The line below is too straight to be earth. That is not how a draftsman describes geology. That is how a draftsman describes a problem. The basin was known locally as the White Flats, a place of blinding heat, brittle crust, and deceptive distance. In winter, a thin skin of water sometimes reflected the sky so perfectly that riders claimed the ground looked like a fallen piece of cloud. In summer, the surface hardened into pale sheets broken by mineral seams and narrow sink lines. Nothing grew there beyond the edges. No permanent settlement stood inside it. No official history attached itself to the place, which is exactly why it was useful. The survey was part of a wider infrastructure review, one of dozens of seemingly unremarkable projects meant to update transport corridors, mineral boundaries, and telegraph routes. The team leader, Adrien Belloc, was not an archaeologist. He was a technical man with 15 years of field experience and a reputation for caution. The photographer, Emile Crew, had previously worked mining disputes. The youngest assistant, Thomas Hale, had joined only 6 months earlier and still wrote in that careful, upright hand of a man trying not to make mistakes. Then there was Varet. Varet mattered because he was the one responsible for turning landscape into lines. If Belloc measured the land, Varet translated it into something the state could keep, file, circulate, and eventually trust. A strange thing seen by a laborer can be dismissed. A strange thing drawn by a draftsman is harder to kill. According to the surviving field fragments, nothing went wrong during the first week. Camps were established, bearings were checked, horizon marks were logged, depth rods were used to test the outer crust near the basin's center. Then, on the morning of August 11th, Hale struck something below the surface that did not behave like compacted salt, mudstone, or mineral shelf. The rod hit hard and stopped dead. Belloc had him test again 6 feet to the right. Same result. Then again, same depth. Again, same depth. By midday, they had marked an entire line across the basin floor where every sounding met resistance at nearly the exact same level. Natural surfaces do not usually announce themselves in perfect repetition. Belloc ordered a trench. The first 2 feet were ordinary enough, Powder, crust, packed mineral, brittle white layering. Then, the men reached a darker band of compressed sediment. Under that sat something flat, pale gray, and unnaturally even. At first, Belloc thought it was a bed of stone. Then Crew washed part of it with canteen water, and the surface reflected light in a way stone should not. Not polished, not glossy, just finished. The edge they exposed ran straight beyond the trench walls in both directions. Varet measured the visible angle, paused, then measured it again. 90 degrees. The official record would later claim the survey had been disrupted by unstable subsurface conditions. That phrasing sounds reasonable until you compare it to what the team actually did next. They expanded the trench. Then they opened a second cut 20 yards away, then a third. By the end of the second day, the 3 openings suggested they were not dealing with random buried slabs at all, but the outer edge of a large geometric form sitting beneath the basin floor. Varet's private tracing showed straight runs, intersecting lines, and one curved enclosure near the northern side, all of it too deliberate to dismiss as accident. Hale wrote that evening that Belloc had become careful in a new way, not frightened exactly, not yet, just quieter, more deliberate about what was said aloud, more willing to send the camp hands away on unnecessary errands. That shift matters. Men in the field know the difference between an inconvenience and a discovery. On August 13th, they widened one of the cuts enough to reveal what looked like a seam or join line, not natural fracture, not erosion, a boundary between 2 fitted surfaces. Crew photographed it from above. In one of the margin notes preserved on the back of a damaged glass plate sleeve, he wrote only this: "Joint visible under wash." A joint means construction. Construction means intention, and intention in a place with no documented builders changes everything. The team stayed 6 more days beyond their planned departure. That extension is never explained in surviving administrative notes, but the field material makes the reason obvious. They had found something and were trying to understand whether it was a platform, a roof, a buried chamber, or the exposed upper edge of something much larger. Then the sounds began. That detail appears in 2 separate fragments. Hale described a low resonance after sunset whenever the air cooled over the basin. Not loud, not mechanical in any familiar sense, just a faint, sustained vibration that seemed to rise through the ground rather than travel across it. Crew described it differently. He said it was like hearing a struck glass far away and below. Belloc forbade them from writing about the sound in the official ledger, which is why it survives only in the private notes. One night, according to Hale, Varet lay flat against the surface with one ear pressed to the exposed line and stayed there so long Belloc had to pull him up by the shoulder. When Belloc asked what he thought he was doing, Varet reportedly answered, "Trying to decide if the place is empty." That is not a geological sentence. That is not a survey sentence. That is a sentence from the moment a technical operation starts turning into something else. This is where the archive breaks apart. There should have been a formal escalation after that. Additional teams, engineers, senior review, protective orders, a revised classification. Instead, what followed was a sequence of contradictions so cleanly arranged they almost read like design. A supply requisition shows extra canvas, lamp oil, and timber braces sent to the camp after the original end date. A transport memo records 2 sealed crates shipped east under restricted handling. A district register confirms receipt of plates and field materials on September 3rd. And yet, the final archive inventory for the same project lists no photographs, no appended sketches, and no field supplements. It is as if the bones of the survey survived, but everything with flesh on it was stripped away. There is one more fragment, and it may be the most revealing of all. In 1956, during the closure of a regional works office, a retired clerk named Miriam Salt found a bundle of obsolete transfer slips scheduled for disposal. One of them referenced the White Flats survey by number and included a handwritten routing instruction: remove drafts showing lower geometry, retain only topographic abstract. Salt copied the line into a notebook she kept for odd records she thought might someday matter. That notebook passed to her nephew, then to a local collector, and from there into the hands of a researcher who photographed the relevant page before the collection was broken up. Remove drafts showing lower geometry. Not destroy duplicate material, not correct measurements.
Remove drafts. That wording tells you exactly what frightened them. Not the basin, not the survey, not even the fact of a buried structure. The geometry. Because geometry can be compared. Geometry can be recognized. Geometry can match other things. Once you have lines, angles, spacing, and proportion, you no longer have folklore. You have design language. And if the design language beneath that basin matched something older, wider, or already half hidden in other parts of the record, then the discovery was no longer local, it was connective. That possibility hangs over every surviving piece of the White Flats case. Varet's tracing does not look like a collapsed mine plan. It does not look like a frontier foundation. It does not look like irrigation channels or military works. It looks like something laid out from a central logic the men on site recognized without fully understanding. Something that belonged to a system, not a ruin. Varet never published anything about the survey. Belloc was reassigned the following year to interior roadwork and never again appears in basin records. Hale left the department before 1910 and reportedly refused to discuss his desert assignment even with family. Crew's plates vanished, but one second-hand account from a cousin claims he kept one damaged exposure wrapped in cloth for years, taking it out only after dark and only when he had been drinking. The cousin said the image showed a pale floor below the white floor. That may sound small, but it is everything. A floor below the floor. A built surface below the natural surface. A hidden layer beneath accepted ground. If true, it explains why the story had to be made administrative instead of public. Public discoveries can be debated. Administrative discoveries can be filed into silence. And silence was what followed. No second survey, no excavation, no museum transfer, no scholarly dispute, just absence. For the public, the White Flats remained what they had always seemed to be: empty salt, bright horizon, nothing underneath worth naming. But archives rarely erase cleanly. A routing slip survives, a tracing survives, a line of pencil survives, and sometimes that is enough to see the outline of what was removed. The real question is not whether every surviving detail can be proved to modern standards. The real question is why a routine survey generated missing drafts, restricted handling, vanished plates, and instructions to remove geometry from the record at all. People do not bury nothing with that much care. Whatever lay beneath that basin in 1908, the men who first exposed it believed it forced the land to stop behaving like land. After that, every action taken by the offices above them suggests the same conclusion: not that the discovery was false, that it was inconvenient. Maybe the structure is still there beneath the crust, sealed deeper now under another century of mineral drift. Maybe its lines remain exactly where Varet drew them, waiting under the white glare for someone with the means to cut through the surface and look again.
Maybe the most important part of the lost survey was not what the team found, but what they understood the moment they measured it, that the desert was not empty, that the ground had been written on before, and that somewhere between the official map and the land itself, a piece of the truth had been deliberately left out. If the White Flats file had survived intact, it might have told us who built that lower geometry, how long it had been there, and why the state chose silence over explanation. Instead, all we have is the shape of the omission. But sometimes the omission tells the story better than the document ever could. Because a missing report can be an accident, a missing photograph can be carelessness, a missing draft can be oversight. But when the map remains and the geometry is what disappears, you are no longer looking at error. You are looking at selection. And selection is where buried history begins.